Welcome to Practice Dirty, a podcast that helps women of color explore their inner well-being. I'm your host, Michaela Rose. I'm a mindfulness facilitator, podcaster, writer, and cowgirl. I've come to learn that there's an inward journey that begins at 40. This process of discovery isn't linear, and the work we have to do can be downright dirty. I'm here to help you along the way. Hello, everyone, and I am back for another episode of Practice Dirty. And today we're talking with Nikki Silvestri of Soil and Shadow. And I'm actually going to let Nikki self-introduce and tell you a little bit about who she is and what she does. Nikki, I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, hi, everyone who's listening. It's really, really great to be here. I have a huge smile on my face, even though you can't see me. And I was thinking about this, like how to introduce myself, because it evolves over time.
Yes.
So brass tacks are, I have been in the climate and food systems sector for the majority of my career. Started as a nonprofit executive director and have been running my own consulting firm for almost a decade. Now we do leadership team and organizational development. And when we first started, we were really strategy heavy. Mm-hmm. But my personal introduction, now that you have all of the checklist items taken care of, is that I'm a Black woman who is really committed to being fully embodied in this lifetime and has recreated my life to centralize having the time and space to care for my own emergence process and to make sure I'm caring for my husband's and my children's as well.
And Nikki, where did that commitment to yourself come from? Like, what was the catalyst for that?
Yeah, I actually have to say, I think it comes from my mom. I don't know that I knew 100% this was my origin story before.
Okay.
My mom is, she has a doctorate in transpersonal and humanistic psychology, and she got her PhD when I was 13. So I started the PhD process. I don't know. I know when I was 13, she was in the middle of it. It took about 7 years. But she just witnessed herself doing things that were not preferable to her. I'm not going to get into the details, but I think as women, we all know we got shit, and my mama certainly had it. And so she just kind of dedicated herself to learning why she was the way that she was. And I think early on, seeing her as the example, it was my father too. They both have master's degrees in counseling, and they got those before my mom got her PhD because they work in the foster system. And so the combination of all of that, my parents working in the foster system, seeing Black and brown children being taken from their homes, wondering as a child why they were parents who didn't have what it took to raise their children safely, realizing that self-work to be able to have a family was going to be really important for me if I wanted to have children. The first job I ever wanted to have was a mother. So it was the combination of many early influences that I think set me up for this is a non-negotiable.
Okay. And was it kind of that seeing that took you into your work within the nonprofit sector when you started your professional life?
It was. Seeing my parents doing work in the foster system, it never occurred to me that you could have a different job. You know, I was like, nonprofits is work. That's what they are. Big corporate was this thing that was on TV. Other types of jobs were just on TV. But what my parents did was what occurred to me as work. So I knew that I fell in love with the ecosystem in college. And that dovetailed with social equity because I couldn't not also do work for my people, you know, and make sure that Black folk were going to be okay in the midst of all that.
But it was ultimately that work that led you to burnout. What happened there?
Ooh, Kayla.
Whole story. Let's go.
Let's go in.
Yes.
So I became a nonprofit executive director at 25. And I had all of the vision and gusto for the work without any, look at my face.
I'm seeing it.
Any of the training required. So the first 2 years were boot camp. What the hell is a profit and loss statement? What is a balance sheet? How do I manage a team? Just like all of the things required to be an executive, I had to learn on a very short curve while I was also learning how to run a local organization with a national presence. And so 4 years of that, and I was tired. But then I got headhunted for this amazing national climate nonprofit executive director job. And it felt like an opportunity I couldn't pass up. One of my mentors said, I know that you think you're burned out, but you're 29. You're not possibly as tired as you think you are. And I was like, okay, let me take that advice. That was advice that was totally right for this person and not for me. But I didn't have discernment at that point in my life because I was going through Mercury retrograde. I was young, So I started this job. I lasted a little under a year. I found out in the middle of that I was going to have pretty significant fertility issues with my husband, that we weren't going to be able to have biological children. And I walked into that job saying to the entire board, like, part of my plan was to get pregnant. I was going to leave my other job anyway and just try to curate a life that was more sane and balanced for having children. And they said, no problem. We can support you with that here. And then when I realized it was going to be a very different journey than I thought, that was a big part of what collapsed me internally. But also I walked in burned out and I didn't realize that. So I just couldn't go as hard as I needed to.
Yeah. And so how did you navigate the burnout in order to come into yourself before you could even come back to yourself? It's like you had to come into yourself. So tell me about that.
I had this incredible executive coach that I found right when I first started the job. And she was one of the main reasons that I ended up leaving with any kind of sanity. Okay. And so when I ended up leaving that job, I went to her and I said, the stuff that you're doing feels different to me. I've never been coached like this before. And she said, that's because it's yoga. It's not like organizational development tools. I'm coaching you around how to be a human being. And I was like, well, great. Can you stop shielding it with organizational Gestalt language and just give me the guts?
Yeah.
So she put me through a 6 or 7 month program right when I left. That was this intensive go down the rabbit hole weekly, like, what is non-duality? Who were you before you were born? Meditation at the Agnya chakra at the third eye and experience the burning of tapas and burning through the dross. Like, we went in and I came out of that having felt like I was in a kiln, and I was forged, and it put me back together.
So I'm going to just take something you said and said, so how did you learn to be a human being again?
Mm-hmm. Well, that process really, it was a comprehensive somatic integration process. Okay. And so I feel like I had the brass tacks to know, to at least have a map of like, this is how I was dissociated. This is what embodiment could be like. And I actually don't think I had that map before. I didn't realize that I walked around the majority of my life dissociated before that process.
And what in working with her, what was the correlation between the recognition of disassociation or dysregulation? Like, what were you not connected to?
That's a deep question. What was I not connected to? I wasn't connected to intimacy, like emotional intimacy.
Okay.
I was profoundly guarded all the time. And this is not an unusual phenomenon for leaders, right? Okay. You look extremely extroverted when you're on stage talking to 10,000 people, and you can smile and you can shake hands when you get off the stage and have these deep feeling one-on-one interactions with people while there's a bunch of other people around. But when you're in a group setting, when I'm in a group setting, I don't actually have to get vulnerable. Like, I learned early on how to perform vulnerability in order to ensure that I had belonging.
Okay.
And it was only through this process that I was able to start the discernment process around when I was performing vulnerability and when I was actually in an equal exchange of offering myself and then receiving someone else. And I mean, it was also profound because as a nonprofit executive director, I was rewarded for performing vulnerability. And it was called good boundaries, right? Like, people would see that I was shielding and guarding a part of myself. But for many of them, it looked like, you're talking to hundreds of people a week. You cannot be unguarded in those situations.
Yes.
But the problem was that I got a job that took an actual area of growth for me and took it to its logical extreme conclusion. And I formed my entire personality around that. But then in spaces where I actually needed to be unguarded and needed to have relationships for myself, I didn't know how to turn it off, which is also not an unusual phenomenon for many, many women in particular that find themselves in leadership positions.
And what was the rebalancing of that like to, maybe maintain that in a professional setting where it was necessary, but releasing it in a personal setting where you needed to not have that as a defense mechanism or a guard rail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I had to go to the other extreme. I mean, There was a period of the first 3 years or so of building my business. I only talked to a very small inner circle of clients. I didn't do any marketing. I was completely word of mouth. And I just hid out in my forest little treehouse with my husband and the forest animals, and had a very spacious calendar, just really tried to streamline my interactions and shrink my interactions. So I had more capacity to observe myself, because I knew I needed to start with observance and observation first in order to be able to do the discernment. But in my nonprofit executive director days, there was just so much interaction and so much stimuli all the time that having the space for observation of self was a luxury. So I needed to reduce the pace of my life in order to create the space for observation of self. And that's what I did.
Okay. And in allowing yourself to create that space, what did that feel like in your body? What did that do to your, and what did that feel like in your mind? Like, were they aligned or were they incongruent and you had to create that?
It took a lot of infrastructure, Michaela. Let me tell you what. I remember, back before kids during that phase when I would have these 1.5 2-hour morning practices. I would go out on the balcony. I would meditate for 45 minutes, doing my mantra practice, do my meditation practice. I would do yoga for an hour after that. Like, just really start the day, giving my body a deep dive intensive on integration, and then have a spacious day so that if I had a meeting for an hour and felt myself dissociate, I could spend the next hour trying to reintegrate, or at least notice the pattern making that was happening. Okay. And that it took a lot of effort to do that, a lot of effort. And my husband helped tremendously. Like, I can't actually overstate how necessary he was during that process, because at that point, he was one of a handful of people that I could be truly unguarded and emotionally intimate with. Okay. We had our problems the way every couple does, but I was living with someone that I didn't have to guard around. And so even though I was guarded much of the time with him, the practice partnership of learning how to be unguarded together, and that being my everyday container, was really necessary. If I had been single, I don't know that it would have happened that quickly.
Yeah. And, when you talk about integration and doing a lot of inner work, I was part of one of your groups recently called Gathering Fire at the Piscinas Ranch in California. And what really struck me about you was your use of shadow work in your personal life and in your business. So what is the correlation between, that your inner exploration, integration, and shadow work in context of personal to start with?
Yeah. I consider dissociation part of the shadow.
Okay.
The more I learn about the more I learn about just early childhood development, raising these kids, and learn about trauma and learn about myself. Yeah. I am a Gabor Mate stan, let's be clear. So a lot of the stuff that I do, I talk about him a lot and his perspective on trauma. But this concept that very early on in our family systems, we learn what behaviors allow us to get access to belonging and emotional safety, knowing that for children, feeling a disconnect from their caregivers feels like life or death. Like, that's how the brain registers it, because we are their shelter, their food, like, they cannot fend for themselves at all. So feeling disconnected is actually a life or death issue for them. And the knowledge that all of us in some way dissociate from parts of ourselves to make sure that we are always as connected to our caregivers as humanly possible. That was a pretty intense concept for me to grok and to accept. I think before I was a mother, I kept thinking there has to be a way for this to not occur. But the older I get and the more I learn about it, the more society would have to change. Parents would have to stop being so up against a wall. We would actually have to have intergenerational rituals. There's so much village infrastructure that allows for children to have multiple caregivers where they can experience attachment and attunement. And that has been sanitized to be this nuclear family that actually cannot give children everything they need. So there will be some defaulting into shadow, into creating a shadow and many shadow selves. So the way that that shows up for me personally is being incredibly compassionate to what my parents' circumstances were. I mean, they were babies when they had me. My mom was 29, my dad was 26, or she was 30, he was 26. And I'm like, I had my first child at 32. I cannot imagine being 30. I can't imagine being 26.
Right.
And I didn't have village any more than I have village. I mean, they had more village than me because, 40 years ago was a thing. But still, they were Black. They were born at a time when they could not vote. I mean, what does that do to your body? You know what I'm saying? So yeah. Older Black folk get a lot of compassion from me, my parents included. And I just went down a rabbit hole personally with the shadow. What was their shadow that they had to grow up with 70 years ago when my mom was born, right? That was a crazy ass time for Black folks. My dad as well, even though he's a bit younger than her. And what did they have to work with when they were raising me in the middle of the gang wars in the mid 80s in Los Angeles? Yeah. What were they trying to protect me from? When you're doing behavior modification with children to save their lives, especially if they're Black children, are there times when you feel it's necessary to sacrifice connection because you're trying to keep them alive? There's so much in terms of the childhood formation of the shadow that felt like it was so informative to some of my leadership struggles when it came to the parts of myself that I disowned in order to have belonging in incredibly complex circumstances when I was raised, and in order to continue to seek belonging with the relationships that I was seeking for the rest of my life. And so personally, I feel like having all of that context for shadow, for trauma, for the formation of the self, it just gives me access to a lot more information now about which relationships I'm choosing, why I'm choosing those relationships, what part of myself I feel like I can share in those relationships, how to continue creating the space for me to be able to be transparent with me. At the very least, I should fully accept myself. And that continues to be a journey. So all of those dimensions are a part of how I take in shadow personally now.
And how have you seen, or do you feel shadow, like the shadow is different for women of color when we are kind of exploring our inner worlds? I mean, you've kind of alluded to there's more complexities, there's more components of trauma and oppression that we deal with. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, if the shadow are the parts of ourself that we disown and lock in a closet in our brains to ensure belonging, then I feel like the natural next step of that is if there's a group of people who have been historically oppressed and marginalized and physically attacked for just existing. I mean, there are many ways that I think about shadow, like bias and shadow are very similar. Bias is what the brain does to say what it is and what it's not. So there is a way that when the brain says, this is what I'm not, all of that goes into shadow. But when I think about the word shadow and Jung's usage of it, I think about the collective unconscious and the cultural implications, right? And so there's a way that I consider Black folk like the shadow of America. Race as a construct is real complex. And the transatlantic slave trade created kind of a new version of it because indentured servants that were white and African slaves were more on the same level in the founding days of America. They were doing just the straight up Marxist, we're going to align for our economic interests and screw the bourgeoisie. And so at some point, the founding folk had to be like, all right, how are we going to separate these folks? We need to have an identity construct that is stronger than their economic interests. We need to really drive in race. We need to make sure that this is a concept that is reinforced consistently and that will identity-wise create a complete dissociation internally. And so I go down that digression because I feel like that's a big way that shadow is different for folks of color. We have been told repeatedly in so many ways, subtle and overt, that just existing is wrong. Yeah. And so what that does to a person's identity construct is a lot. And the other thing I'll say about it is I've been recently coming into the realization about how that's actually a layer on top of the childhood trauma. I think different folks can have different opinions about this, and I'm still kind of forming mine. But I wonder if a parent is able to provide that attunement attachment, if caregivers are able to give an infant body what it needs before race consciousness comes into play, before identity constructs come into play, then once those do come into play, it's sitting on top of psychological safety and experience of wholeness and self and care. And that will probably create a different racial identity once it's formed. And so for me, that just goes into the destruction of the Black family being one of the worst things that has happened to us as a people.
Yeah. And so when you've worked with other women, what are some of the biggest challenges or of their own that you've seen when they're trying to start to do this work?
Women of color specifically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if we need to keep it broader to women, because I think that was a theme in Gathering Fire. It really was regardless of race. It was really about women as a collective. So let's just keep it women as a collective. The challenges thereof to do this work, because that was evident amongst no matter who they were during that time.
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest challenges I see is facing the tears and the pain of not belonging. Yeah. Like acknowledging the shadow means acknowledging why those particular parts of us went into the shadow in the first place, which usually provokes a lot of pain, a lot of sadness, returning to that point in one's life and giving it care. It's an honor to steward women through that.
And why is it important for them to actually to do this work? Lean into the discomfort of exploring and excavating the parts that have been repressed and then pushed down.
Because we can't experience ecstasy unless we experience grief.
Oh, I love that.
And many of the women that come to me for coaching are, a vast majority of them now are in transition or are looking to really make sure that the next phase of their life, they can be more whole and happier and more in alignment with themselves than they were in the last phase of their life. And in order to do visioning and know where you want to go, you got to be able to access your own ecstasy. And so this shadow work, it just expands the band. Listeners, you're not going to be able to see this, but like, let's say that there's a band of space that's as wide as your head of your emotional range. You're trying to expand it to the width of your shoulders. And you can't go in the ecstasy direction to know what you want unless you can go in the grief direction to see what your shadow has been.
And as women kind of progress through this journey, like into that next and into better alignment, what are some of the kind of polarizing realizations that you see them having?
Say more about that. What do you mean by polarizing realizations?
Well, what I was hearing was that, you've got to go through the grief in order to experience the ecstasy. And so that's it's an evolution of self. And so they're leaving a previous version of themselves that no longer fits, and they're embracing a new one that's more values aligned. So as that, and I know that there's always, at least I think, there's a moment in that becoming the new and next, with the integration and the congruent, where there's a spark and there's something that comes on. So I'm just wondering, what does that look like? Or do you see that even?
Yeah, I do see that. I'm trying to think of an example that would help. I don't know that we will use this question. There isn't an answer coming to mind that feels like it makes sense.
That's totally fine. So I'm going to use that though, then maybe to kind of move it back over to you. Cause I know that in our conversations that, as you've been on this continual evolution of self, you then entered the new space of becoming the mother that you always wanted to be. And now that you have your children, that's definitely had an impact on the way in which this process is happening. So could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my fertility journey was windy. It took 4.5 years to get pregnant with my first child and thousands of dollars. And I feel like the way the entire arc, right? Like the full, at this point, 10 years of my fertility and childbearing journey, it's given me the discipline of someone who's in the military. My little brother's in the military, and we talk about this sometimes, but boot camp breaks you. And that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to break you so that you can be built up with character and with strength. The most idealized version of boot camp in the military, at least. And I feel like that happened to me during the postpartum pregnancy and postpartum. Pregnancy was almost a year, 10 months of the most excruciating physical discomfort. Not the full 10 months, but just having a being that I cared about more than I care about myself growing inside my body. It created an experience of vulnerability that I had never felt before. And being dissociated and getting pregnant, I think that's why it was so jarring for me, because I was closer to being embodied than I had ever felt. And it felt like over vulnerability. Whereas now I feel like I would have a lot more point of reference for that. And then staying up all night with my children sometimes, but even just in the early days, just waking up every few hours to nurse. I got to know a different relationship with sleep, that being broken down so that I could be built back up, going through 20 hours of a home birth with my second child, going through a C-section with my first, like gaining and losing 50 pounds twice. There were just so many physiological discipline things that I had to go through in order to have children and have a different relationship to what I thought that I needed for emotional and mental stability. I also went through some postpartum anxiety and had to get really clear about my care practices. And so what that's given me, just when you read these leadership books with these white men that are like, I do bulletproof everything and I fast and I climb Mount Everest and I do the Wim Hof cold plunge, like they do all of these things, right? To give themselves mental and emotional clarity so that they can be a top performer and have world-class productivity, quote unquote. And I'm like, so did I. So do I. So do most of the peoples who bring children through their bodies. And even if you don't bring a child through your body, you still up all night if you get an infant trying to feed them. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like motherhood is, not only is it just as impactful as some of those other techniques, it is even more so because you have to be unguarded and heart open and vulnerable in the midst of it. You can't scream and shout. Well, you can, but most of us don't want to scream and shout at a 6-month-old who's crying at 2 a.m. after they just cried at 1 and 12 during the developmental leap phases. I just had to actually figure out how to have less capacity and rise while keeping my heart even more open because I wanted these babies to have the experience of psychological safety. And that gives me access to just what I'm able to do for my clients. How I'm able to build my business, what I'm able to offer in my social change work is exponentially greater because of this discipline and capacity.
You know, and I think that goes into, and I'm not even going to apologize for my language, but I'm going to take this a little bit of a different way, but the not basic bitch business model, right? Like like the thing I've noticed about you is that there's a level of mastery in all the things that you say and do, and you embody this. Like I mean, it was polarizing to me when I first met you of how that came through, and I was just like, this woman is amazing. She fits no traditional model that everybody pushes on the internet, the coaching, the business, the whatever. So talk to me about that. Like, talk to me about how you, like, working beyond basic. Does that make sense? Like, because you don't do the traditional watered down, boiled down, and you have built this very dynamic practice that then, like you said, carries over, that has been also has a carryover from your personal life.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. One of the most present not basic bitch business things that's up for me right now is the dead sprint to clarify and simplify that's out there in the business world. And I think it was a dynamic that I didn't understand before the way that I understand it now, which is basically that in order to scale, you do need to simplify and clarify so that people understand exactly what their problem is according to you and according to their words, understands exactly how you can help them solve their problem, and gets a step-by-step process within which they're going to be taken through that journey.
Yeah.
That's how you scale a business.
Yep.
And I think, to their credit, so many business training programs and things give you the map within which to do that. Mm-hmm. And they tell you the only way to scale is to have a simplified model, which is true. And I tried to scale and simplify too quickly several times, and it didn't work. And now I'm seeing the wisdom of that, right? Yeah. Like what I had was a very fertile, very diverse ecosystem. And I was learning how to tend to and care for that. And I wasn't scaling, quote unquote. I was growing at a very sustainable pace, but I was just growing. I wasn't scaling. I'm actually, I think, ready to scale now, but it was a totally organic process that took almost 10 years to do. I had to learn my ecosystem first. Before you can push your ecosystem to produce more, you have to know how to do that in a way that's not going to cumulatively deplete the soil. Yeah. And so I think that that's the last thing I'll just say about it is that's something that I don't see as taught, like the risks of scaling too quickly.
And I would agree with that. It's why I asked the question, because it is, and I like the, again, we're both land loving girls. I love the analogy to biodiversity, right? You can't just plant one thing one year, plant the one thing the next year, and basically monocrop. You have to spread things out. You have to try, you have to grow, you have to have the experience. And then once you find the thing, then you, like you said, then you can focus on simplification and scale because you've got the one thing. And so many of those models, even the trainings that I went to as well, were like that. And I was like, but I don't know how to do this. It's not the right step at the right time. So I love that. And I think that's the best explanation I've heard of how that is counterintuitive to development, personal and business, out there. So thanks. I love it. Mm-hmm. So Nikki, like, what are some of your own personal spiritual practices? Like, what do you gravitate towards in order to maintain your center and do all that you do?
Yeah. Well, the yogic lineage that I'm a part of is a huge one.
Okay.
I was recently given a mantra and was instructed to say it 108,000 times. So it's going to take me a few years because it's a 10-second at least mantra to say. It's not a short mantra, right?
Okay.
But it's beautiful. Like, it gives me a discipline practice that's going to take me over a period of years. And I have a nature spirit practice where all of my work is kind of run through direct connection with nature spirits. And I use muscle testing to ask very specific questions about whether to go this direction in my business, whether to go that direction in my business and in my life. And that's super helpful. I have a archangel's prayer circle. That's my healing circle.
Okay.
There are several lineages that I've been introduced to over the course of my life that I've dedicated myself to. And now I feel like I just have a toolbox and I'm able to pull from that toolbox at will. But it took me years to get here.
I love it. So now I'm gonna ask you, is there anything that you'd like to share that I haven't asked?
Mm-hmm. I would say if you're intrigued by what you've heard and you would like to move along this journey with me, either in a group coaching situation or in one-on-one executive coaching, what we offer at Soil and Shadow is the Joy and Impact Academy, which is the group coaching situation that does have a shadow work through the perspective of composting component, which is one of my favorite things to facilitate. So I would encourage folks to go to the website and check that out. And on the executive coaching side, that's where you just get access to everything. Everything I just said, we go through a pretty deep intake process, and I take people through a 3-month journey with me where we get intensive and we come up with some goals and we work it out. So I am very interested in women that are interested in this work and would love to hear from you.
And what is one book you feel that any woman should read on any journey, whether it's spiritual, professional, or developmental?
Oh, one book.
Only one. I need the one.
It hurts. Well, since we were talking about shadow work, Pigs Eat Wolves, Going Into Partnership with Your Dark Side by Charles Bates.
I love it. Okay. And what is one thing every woman should stop doing right now?
Ooh!
Only one.
Talking to themselves in anything less than an exquisitely mother energy loving voice upon first waking in the morning.
I adore it. It's perfect. So, Nikki, where can everyone find you online if they want to reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, soilandshadow.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your story.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Practice Dirty. Please support this podcast by subscribing on iTunes or Spotify and leaving us a rating. If you're looking for the best self-guided mindfulness and discovery tools available for women over the age of 40, head over to michaelarose.com. I'll see you next time.